work, unions, and injustice at Stony Brook, especially union issues in the wake of the Janus decision, about which we'll hear a lot more in a bit. This is a follow-up of our session last Thursday, which included some speakers talking about our austerity blues era in public higher education. We had a discussion about all these, what are those blues? Some of them may sound familiar to us here at Stony Brook. The interconnected politics of austerity and defunding, privatization initiatives, yes, corporatization of our administration, adjunctification, attacks on public sector unions. Oh, that's a big deal today. And then the consequences for student experiences in public higher education, of course, are many. I encourage everyone to check out the videos for last Thursday, and we're also planning on publishing a summary of this on our website to make it a little easier to digest. We'll do the same with this one. And so we'll have a couple of, these are linked sessions, the one with the broader issues, and this one more focused on Stony Brook. I'd encourage you also to look at the panel that we had last Thursday following the plenary by Fabricant Breyer. We had a number of people coming from different public universities in the Northeast and talking about their experiences there. There's a lot of parallels there are with Stony Brook, and the union's role is made plain in that, but also sort of the problematics of unions trying to address these kinds of issues given the divided workforce, given all the pressures that unions are under these days. So I think we'll hear a lot of similar stories today. Our first session is on the history and context, the larger context of what our union leaders in the second session will then kind of tease apart. Our session includes our moderator, Kevin Moriarty, familiar to you all, I imagine, but I've learned a little something about him from his bio, so I'll share that with you. He is a decorated Vietnam-era veteran. He's also worked with the Corps of Engineers. He has a BS in engineering and an MBA, as well as a PhD in industrial engineering. And he has spent a lot of time before coming to Stony Brook, I guess, or maybe it's overlapping, in industry, various senior management positions in Festo, Siemens, Thermo Fisher, and so on. Here at Stony Brook, he's a member of the full-time faculty at Stony Brook's College of Engineering or Applied Sciences in that department, Technology and Society. And he's been here since 1997. He doesn't have on here, though, his officer role in the union. So he's the president of the West Campus chapter of the UUP since 2016. So for the last 2 years, 2.5 years, he's been serving as president. Our other speakers today include Michael Zweig. I think familiar to you all. He's now an Emeritus professor of economics, but so well known across campus for all that he's done and over the decades, both on campus with the Center for the Study of Working Class Life and with the union. And his accomplishments there also are manyfold. Our second speaker is Judy Wishnia, who is also a longtime Stony Brook faculty member and union activist. She taught the first course here in women's history, is that right? That's right. In 1976.
It may have been the first course in SUNY, I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah, we'll have to fact check that one. But she's been involved, so she's taught, worked in the history and women's studies joint appointment until she became emeritus. She has served on the UUP in various capacities, academic grievance chair a member of the statewide executive board, and she's now chair of the statewide network of UUP retirees. No? Or was?
I gave up last year.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Update. And she's also been involved in the faculty senate as vice president and as a statewide senator. With all those introductions in mind, I think we're going to hear a lot of informed perspectives about this history in larger context, where the Stony Brook labor movement today. And I'll turn it over now to Kevin, who will be our moderator for this first discussion.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. So what we're going to do here is Mike Zweig is going to start off, and we're going to attempt to try and go through the 4 questions that Chris and the panelists asked us to address here. And so Mike's going to talk about some history, and then when he's finished, then Judy's going to fill in some of the gaps there and take it a little bit further. So what we basically have is what unions are active at Stony Brook today, how big are they, and what do they consist of? When and how did they first emerge? What was the golden age of the unions? Again, that's part of what Mike is going to talk about. Next then is what have been the major trends in the union, the movements in the public sector, and how have they been reflected here at Stony Brook? And last but not least, bringing us up to date, we're going to be talking about what the Janus decision was, is, its impact, and how it's affecting us and how it's affecting public sector unions. So with that said, Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Good to be here. Good to be with you. I think what I want to do is put UUP's history in the context a little bit of public sector unionism in the country, public sector unionism in New York State in particular. The legal framework for trade unionism in the United States is divided between the public sector and the private sector. Private sector unions are controlled in their legal operations by federal law, starting with the Wagner Act, or the National Labor Relations Act, in 1935, which gave, for the first time in American history, full legal protection to workers in their attempts to organize unions. That had never been in existence until the Depression-era labor uprisings, and it's important to note that that law was passed in 1935, but if you look at 1934, the year before, there was a general strike in the San Francisco Bay Area for longshoremen organizing. There was a general strike in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where Teamsters organized. There was a massive strike of garment workers all up and down the East Coast, from the Carolinas all the way up to Maine, involved hundreds of thousands of garment workers that went on for months. Ultimately, it was unsuccessful. That strike was broken. But 1934 was a period of intense labor struggle that scared the bejesus out of the ruling elites of this country and the corporate world, and they decided it was time to really systematize labor relations and give workers some rights that the government was bound to protect. And that was the Wagner Act in 1935, but again, only for private sector workers, and it excluded important categories. It excluded public sector workers explicitly, and it excluded household labor, and it excluded agricultural labor. So if you think about the public sector, well, they just didn't want unions in the public sector because they were public employers themselves, the government, but also they really didn't want to have black people covered in order to get the Southern vote, the Southern Democrats, to vote for that law in 1935. So they excluded agricultural and household labor, which is where the overwhelming majority of African American labor force was concentrated. So the Wagner Act set the terms for a very substantial increase in collective bargaining and in union membership that followed through the end of the Depression, World War II, and into the end of World War II and afterwards in the 50s and the early 60s. Millions and millions of people organized into unions, but they were all private sector unions because public sector was excluded. In New York, in 1966, there was a massive strike in the public transit system in New York City, and it was legal. There wasn't. They were organizing a union. It was the Transit Workers Union. There was this massive strike, a huge disruption, and Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who at the time ran the government in New York State, came to support unionization in public sector, where that was going to be determined by state law. So while private sector unionization is covered by federal law, public sector unionization is covered separately in every state in the country, and different states have different rules about it. In New York, the rules were set basically in what was called the Taylor Act in 1967 that followed that big strike. Now, why were they interested, the government in the state legislature and Governor Rockefeller, in promoting public sector unions in New York was exactly to give some boundaries to the militants and to the organizational capacity that workers demonstrated in that strike in 1966. So just as 1934 was a year of tremendous labor upsurge that resulted in the federal government giving some ground, the same was true that in New York State that provided the legal framework for public sector. Now, of course, we are public sector, and as soon as that law was passed, there were beginning attempts to organize in SUNY and in CUNY. City University faculty organized first, and they had their professional staff congress organized, and they already had contracts. When we were starting to think about having unions, we could look to PSC and see, oh, the people in CUNY are paid more than we are. The people in CUNY have better benefits. The people in CUNY have a better situation than we do here in SUNY, so maybe we ought to think about why is that, and wouldn't you know, they have a union and we don't. So that got some people thinking, maybe what we need to do is have a union here. The main impetus, I think it's fair to say, for organizing what became UUP came out of the professional employees, not so much the faculty. Professional employees had no continuing appointment. They had nothing remotely similar to what we had as faculty called tenure. And so there was a desire on the part of the professional staff to organize and to get for themselves permanent appointment, if not in a contract, legislatively, if not legislatively, and then in a contract, so that there would be those protections and they couldn't be fired, they couldn't be harassed arbitrarily by their supervisors, and that's what a union does. Now, a lot of the professional staff had a labor background, had a labor history, because they came more out of the working class, more likely to be working class origin than people who came into the faculty, although that wasn't exclusively the case. But that was largely that the professional employees had more of an orientation and a more of a comfort level, personal comfort level with unions than the faculty. Although in the early part of the organizing of UUP in the late 60s into the early 70s, the faculty were very young. The institution was very young, particularly here at Stony Brook. And so a lot of the people who were coming in the faculty, were coming in as untenured assistant professors. They'd come out of SDS, they'd come out of the 60s, they'd come out of that environment in which unions were a natural part of the sort of social landscape. And so it became a possibility to even think about organizing unions and collective bargaining among the faculty. So one of the things that the Taylor Law did is it established something called the Public Employee Relations Board, PERB, P-E-R-B. Now, PERB is there just for the state of New York, sort of analogous to the National Labor Relations Board, which was set up by the Wagner Act to regularize and to sort of systematize and to administer the labor law on a federal level. PERB is here in New York State to administer the legislation that sets up collective bargaining in the state of New York. And again, it's a state agency, And it was there in the in the late 60s, early 70s, trying to figure out what to do with these union organizing drives that were beginning to happen. And I'm going to talk particularly about SUNY. Well, two questions have to be resolved when you organize a union. Question number one, what is the bargaining unit? That's who is going to be covered by this collective bargaining agreement, and how are they going to be put together into one collective unit? That's one question. Second question, once you have that bargaining unit, those people then get to vote on whether they want to have a union at all, or if they want to have a union, which union? And there can be an election, and PERB supervises that election, and that election then is for the members of the bargaining unit, the potential members of the bargaining unit, everybody, because nobody's a member of the union or not a member until there's an election. So the whole bargaining unit votes, and on the ballot are any of the unions that want to represent that workforce, that bargaining unit. It can only be one. All right, there's a single representation. You can't have three unions representing the same bargaining unit, different pieces of it. It's one bargaining unit, one representative. So you have different choices, and then you have no union. That's also a choice. You don't have to vote for a union. You can say, I don't want a union, and you can vote for that. And if that gets a majority of the votes, then that's what it is. There's no union, the representation fails, and the workforce just continues on the basis of their individual relationship to their supervisors. Well, in PERB, it was decided that the bargaining unit was going to be all the faculty and all the professional staff together in one bargaining unit. And it was going to be all SUNY state-supported campuses. Now, SUNY, if you think about it or you read sometimes, you'll see it says it represents 64 campuses in New York State. And that's true in the sense that there are 64 campuses in New York State that report, whose management reports up to the State University of New York. But most of them are community colleges, like Suffolk County Community College, Nassau County Community College, Onondaga County, they're all over the state. There's over 30 of them. And those are technically part of SUNY, but they are local in the sense that they are really organized by their counties, and they negotiate, if they do negotiate, their faculty and staff with the county level collective bargaining, even though they get some state money. So state-supported campuses were going to be the basis for this new union. And there was one further exception. Not only were the community colleges exempted, but Cornell University has a state-supported section of it. People don't often remember, but Cornell is a land-grant college. It was set up in the 1860s as a land-grant college to support public agriculture in the state of New York. There are still Cornell extension services all out here in Riverhead, and in Southold Town there's a marine biology center that's a Cornell extension service. Those are state supported, but they're not part of our bargaining unit. So anyway, there was the question. Here's the bargaining unit. It's all of the state supported SUNY schools, and it's going to be the faculty and the professional staff together.
And the librarians.
And, well, yes, the librarians, thank you, which were also part of the crew, and the librarians themselves are divided. Some are academics and some are professional, depending on what their specific job obligations are. So there was a campaign. There were some, there's a whole complicated history of the way in which the professionals through SPA and through other organizations worked on a statewide basis first to start to get the ball rolling. But that, I'm going to leave aside all the ins and outs of that. I will say that there is a book coming out, I think the beginning of next year, written by two former presidents of UUP, statewide presidents, Nuala Drescher and Bill Shoreman, on the history of UUP, which will detail all this a little bit more carefully than I want to take the time to do right now. Suffice it to say that there were people who were for having a union, the AFT. There were people who were sort of more wanted a professional association like NEA or like the AAUP, American Association of University Professors. And there was votes. And in the end, after a runoff election, AFT, American Federation of Teachers, won that election and won the right to represent SUNY faculty. Absent from that original bargaining unit were the classified personnel, which is CSEA, and also absent was the graduate students. Graduate students had no union. The classified service, so-called, had CSEA, and they did have a union. There were faculty, well, especially there were professionals who wanted to work with CSEA more than they wanted to work with the faculty, and so there was a back and forth about who gets to be representing who and what are the alliances, and all that got complicated. But in the end, when all the dust settled, we had CSEA on campus, very important union, organizes all over the state of New York, all over SUNY campuses, and we have the president of our local CSEA here, and we're going to hear about that later. And it's a very important part of the environment, the collective bargaining and labor environment and the work environment here. But it's a different union. The graduate students had no union. And actually, UUP, as graduate students tried to organize, UUP opposed the graduate student organizing. And faculty, generally speaking, were opposed to graduate students organizing, holding the graduate students were not workers, but were students. And as students were not covered by the collective bargaining law that gave public employees the right to organize, and so that was a whole separate campaign that if we want to get into, and I think later on we'll hear from GSEU, but I'll just throw that in. The basic question was, are they workers or are they students? And when it finally came, CWA took the matter to PERB in the early 1980s, I guess, and I was one of the only faculty members in all of SUNY that would go testify on behalf of the students and say, on my experience from being a professor in the economics department, these people are workers. Yes, they're here as students, but they teach these courses because we don't have the faculty to teach them. They are teaching these courses because we need to bring these students through a program, and these are the workforce members that allow us to do that. And so they are workers, and that eventually won the day. And so GSEU is a union. There are a lot of complications that come from having a bargaining unit that is one unit for professionals and academics together. There's strength in that, and from the point of view of the state, they want to have as few bargaining units as they can muster in order to simplify their bargaining agenda, because the state has to bargain with all these unions, and they don't want 18 unions in the university. They want one or two. They don't want to fool around with all these different bargaining issues and different deadlines and different strike possibilities and picket lines. They want the most concentrated union representation that they can get, and that's why they supported these consolidated units. So just to give you an example of a problem, and Joel Rosenthal, who's back there, as was a grievance chair, knows this very well, very often grievances come from professionals or from junior faculty, and they're targeting senior faculty who are members of the union. So you have the union representing its members in a grievance against other members of the union. Well, that gets a little dicey. You know, we have a duty to represent our members. So we would go, and I was vice president of our chapter for many years, and we would go to collective bargaining meetings with the administration and labor management meetings and say, look, we have this problem with this manager, and they would say, that's not a manager, that's a member of your unit. And we would say, yes, but as a department chair or as a leader in that area of work, that person is representing you as a manager, and so it's your responsibility to make sure that that person treats our members properly. Well, and so there's this whole dance that goes on about that. So what we have here is collective bargaining, and I'll just finish with two observations about it. Number one, for faculty, it's always been difficult to get faculty on this campus really organized and consistently working in the union. There are faculty like Joel and Gary Marker and Chris and myself and Judy and there are others who typically come out of labor backgrounds or are old enough to remember when unions were really strong and really meant something in the society at large, and came here in order to build a public institution and saw that unions were a necessary and important part of that. But that's a tough row to hoe, particularly more recently as the system is being disintegrated. One other thing, talking about system being disintegrated, there was a decision made that the collective bargaining would be for SUNY as a whole. There wouldn't be a contract for the university centers and another one for the four-year colleges. There wouldn't be one for Stony Brook and then another one for Albany and here or there. It was all for SUNY. That's because it used to be the State University of New York. It still is, but they don't talk about it. What is the name of this institution? What do you, when you put down at the bottom of your letterhead, you sign your name, what do you put? Stony Brook University. This is the State University of New York at Stony Brook, please. This is not Stony Brook University, because what happens when it's Stony Brook University is that its character as a state institution evaporates. So when you read in Newsday that Stony Brook University faculty member made some breakthrough, or Stony Brook University Hospital did some wonderful thing, you don't know that that was a public institution. You don't know that that's something that the state of New York has championed for decades and is desperately in need of support and aid as a state institution to challenge the privatization. So UUP is very much central to holding up the banner of SUNY and the state university and public higher education. Now, one last point that's important, very important, I think, for UUP history, we are obviously mostly involved in terms and conditions of employment. That's true. But we're also involved, and Judy will talk about this, and Joel and other people who are here, in paying attention to the broadest scope of social justice and economic justice issues in the country. We're a union, we represent our members, and we cannot represent our members only by paying attention to what's going on campus. Because what's going on campus, what's going on in SUNY, is embedded in a whole social system that needs to be addressed. And collective bargaining through contracts is not the only way we can address the issues that face our members. And so UUP has been a charter member, for example, of U.S. Labor Against the War since 2003. We've done a lot of work on women's issues. We've done a lot of work with Black Lives Matter, all kinds of areas of work where social justice is at stake. Our union is there. And that can be a battle, that can be a challenge, but that is also very much part of what our history is, and it's one reason why I have been continued to be active from the early organizing days until now, is because I have that appreciation of what a union should be, and I'm happy that there are so many others of us here sitting in this room and elsewhere that are trying to carry that legacy forward. And that's what I think this session is for, and I want to thank Chris and the new Center for Study of Inequality, Social Justice, and Policy for making this possible. It's a fine successor to the Center for Study of Working Class Life.
Very good, Mike. Thank you.
I just want to add one thing to what Michael said before I do my bit, and that is UUP is instrumental in keeping us a state institution financed by the state, because every year, it's going throughout the country now, states are not supporting their state institutions. And in New York, every year they cut the budget, and every year we're in Albany yowling at our legislators, and the legislators do respond, because if you attack, Long Island would survive, perhaps, but if you cut funds for Cortland or Geneseo or something, the town would die. And so we have real support in the legislature, but we have to go there all the time and scream, okay?
And SUNY doesn't.
And SUNY does not. I sat on a number of Senate committees and so forth. We met with SUNY, and they were never interested in, fighting for the budget. They know we fight for it. Anyway, let me continue, though, with the story that unions go beyond wages and hours and conditions of employment and so forth. They also are part of the move for social justice in this country. Unions have always been in the forefront of issues of social justice. And I will tell you that so let me talk a little bit about Stony Brook. In 1974, the women at Stony Brook, there were very few women at the time, not in the country, I mean at Stony Brook, had a class action suit. There were very few women faculty and professionals, and they were paid much less than men with similar or even less qualifications. Plus, it was hard to get tenure. And we had the entire nursing school in our suit. So it was a very, don't forget this is 1974 to 1976. And we had a wonderful lawyer who did it pro bono, but we needed money, lots of money, for depositions, archives, the whole thing. And I was sent up by the women, go talk to the union in Albany. And I went up and I got them to give us $300,000 toward the class action suit. So the union was always with us in terms of making sure that women got equal pay and so forth. We lost the suit, by the way. 1981, Reagan had become president, and he appointed a judge who said, oh yeah, Stony Brook discriminates against women, but that's society, it's not Stony Brook. And so, however, and some people, it was so egregious for some people that they got wage increases. But it did stop what happened at Stony Brook. Women were no longer hired at lower salaries, and people went on to get, professorships and so forth. So it changed, what should I say, the atmosphere at Stony Brook, even though we lost the suit. Another thing that our union was very active in and brought it to the national organization was South Africa. When the national organization was perfectly happy to let things ride, we raised the issue of the African National Congress, the release of Nelson Mandela from jail. We brought it to the national organization, and you were almost physically assaulted. I was told to go back to Russia and so forth. However, we were on the right side of history, and we prevailed. And so that was an important role that our union played in convincing the teacher unions to come over to the right side in South Africa. Michael will talk more about it, but he is incredibly active in U.S. labor against the war, and UUP was one of the first organizations to join that, and that is very important. And frankly, I arrived here in 1968, and the first thing I remember is getting on a bus sponsored by UUP to go to Washington to protest the war in Vietnam. That's how old I am.
There was no UUP in 1968. Was SDS?
SDS.
Ah,
Okay.
yeah, we
All
did
right.
that.
Anyway, but it went from Stony Brook.
Yes.
So we have always been active in making sure there's diversity in the faculty and the students. And I want to add one last thing. I see I'm running out of time. And that is, I'm retired. And when I was, young, I never thought about retirement. That was something, But let me tell you, to be a union member and be retired is a wonderful thing. You continue your health insurance, you get a vision, and you can join vision and dental, you can get hearing aids, okay? So it really is important. We have people who do not belong to the union, and when they retire, 2 days before they join, because they want the retiring benefits, we're going to change that. We're going to make them sure that they're in the union for at least a year before that. But anyway, the union has been incredibly important in social justice issues, and I think that is, for me, the reason after all these years I'm still working in the union as Michael is. Okay.
Thank you, Judy.
Can I add to pick up on the social justice? In the contract, the administration has to meet with the union executive committee at least once a semester.
Correct.
And that's a place where pressure is often put upon the president by the union exec to do something. I was at a meeting when Shirley Kenny was president, and this was after 9/11, and the question came up of, should the library keep a record of who checked out a book? And the librarians wavered, the head librarian. And we convinced Shirley Kenny to say, no, when you return a book, the record's wiped out.
Yep.
So the FBI couldn't come and see who's reading books about 50 Shades of Grey or Pipe Bomb or whatever people want to read. And I think it was clearly the presence of the exec that convinced, in this case, the president, who was on the fence. And she was quite willing to come down on what we call the right side, because we have these sort of small meetings.
Yeah, and she sat with the dean of the libraries in that meeting and said to the dean of the libraries, this is what we're going to do. And it took a while to convince her, but it is a good example of the kind of work we've done.
Okay.
Very good point, Joel. So to wrap up very quickly, just the last question, that was the Janus case. So I'm going to do this very briefly, as quick as possible. Try to get it done in 2 minutes. The Janus case is a monumental case that was just passed this year, the Supreme Court case, which changed the complexion of unions in general. The Abood case of the 1970s, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, it's either 74 or 77?
77.
77.
Is when the court decided it. It came up from before then, but the decision was in 77.
So 1977, the Supreme Court decided that everyone within the bargaining unit had to pay their fair share of the union negotiating for the bargaining unit. You did not have to be a member, but you still had to pay your fair share, so you had to pay a fee. You had to pay a fee for the benefits that the union negotiated for the entire bargaining unit. That stood since 1977. With this Supreme Court now, the case was just heard and overturned and said, well, the Janus case was heard on the premise of the fact that they argued that it violated his First Amendment rights because unions speak politically and take away his First Amendment rights to the freedom of speech. And if they were speaking on his behalf. Make no mistake about the fact that it had nothing to do with that issue whatsoever. It was a decision based on trying to bust unions. The conservative Supreme Court today does not feel that people should be forced to have to pay the freight for being a member of the union. So the basic situation here is that now you no longer don't have to be a union member, as was before, but in addition, you don't have to pay your fair share of contributing to that either. So in advance of that, the governor passed an amendment to the Taylor Law in his budget. So it wasn't through the legislature. It was done. It was statute through the budget, where he said that that's fine. The amendment to the Taylor Law says unions will no longer have to represent members under Article 19 for disciplinary actions. Everything else within the bargaining unit, they still have to be represented for. They still get all the benefits through the balance of the bargaining unit. So the first question we usually get asked is, why are they still getting health care and vision? Well, the Benefits Trust Fund pays for that. We negotiate for that. We negotiate for the entire bargaining unit. So it's not a major burden to the union that we still offer those benefits. Other benefits, it is a bit of a burden, and there's a management of that. So as Judy alluded to, we are looking at now to make some changes to the union's constitution in the fact that we need to make adjustments for quote-unquote what we're calling freeloaders. You don't get to take a free ride, but right now the law is such that they can. So one major change also is the fact that they are not eligible for membership-only benefits. They're not eligible to participate in any union meetings, they've never been able to hold union office or whatnot, but so now we're cutting back on that. The thing that Judy alluded to was the fact that in the past you could sign up for the union 2 days before you retire. You'd get the benefits. And that's one of the proposals that we have to the Constitution of the union right now, to put a vesting period on that. So there are still more changes that are going to be coming. To end this portion of it, I just say this. The effects of the Janus case across the entire country have resulted in increases in union membership, not decreases. But that said, that was the immediate, because many people who were fee payers didn't know they were fee payers. They saw they were paying a fee. They thought that was dues. They thought they were a member, because they're members on the peripheral. When they found out they were not members, they converted their fee into dues. They became members. The bigger issue is the fact that the new employees coming in who've never been part of a union before are saying, well, why do I want to be in a union? I'm 25, 26 years old, I'm 30 years old, or I'm 45 years old and I worked in industry and I was never part of a union before. Why would I want to pay 1% and become part of a union? So currently the statistic on that is, throughout the state, only 47% of new hires in New York State and UUP are now becoming members. If that trend continues, the union will not survive. So we have to aggressively go out there and organize and pitch exactly why they get the benefits that they do get. So that's the Janus case kind of summed up.
Okay, are there any other questions people want to ask of the panel here? I mean, we'll have plenty of time for discussion more directly directed to Janus with the next panel.
Don't be shy.
Okay, so why don't the next panel just come up? We can maybe take a few minutes for that sort of changeover, and people can go to the restroom. And I thought we'd have catering here. I'm sorry, I thought they would be here by now, but.
And I have a little information about U.S. labor against the war for people.
And I just to point this out, we have until 4 o'clock here, and then we're going to be, if we want to continue, we have another room, but we have to move. So that's a kind of constraint that we face with this next panel as well. Though we're just starting these conversations, and this is just the kickoff for what I hope will be continuing dialogue.